Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TBR's webcast, Why We Believe Large IT Services Vendors Are Taking 2 Steps Forward and 1 Back. Recapping performance as reported in our Managed Private and Professional Services Cloud Benchmark with a focus on Cloud Professional Services. My name is Allison Crawford, and I'll be your host for today's session. In the next 45 minutes, Senior Analyst Ramuna Svarkas will walk you through the trends driving the results and how vendors have fared over the last quarter, followed by a Q&A of these trends and how they will affect you. Before I pass this over to Ramunas, there are a few logistics I'd like to cover. First, we're recording today's session and we'll be posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the others that we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the materials we're presenting. Please send any questions or comments to the Q&A function or chat function to the right of your screen. Ramunas will address them at the end of the presentation. Or, if you'd like to set up a client inquiry for more detailed discussion, please reach out directly to Ramunas at the end of the webinar to set up that conversation. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find the slides, as well as other thought leadership pieces, webinar decks, and commentaries on SlideShare at www.slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight, and I'll be sharing all these social media links with you again at the end of the presentation. Now, let me introduce Ramunas Svarkas. Ramunas is one of our senior analysts within the TBR Professional Services practice area. In addition to focusing on several of the largest IT services vendors, he also spearheads our Global Delivery Market Landscape Benchmark and is the lead professional services analyst in our newly initiated cloud program. He was instrumental in kicking off our cloud-related research with our first customer research study on the use of cloud professional services in 2010, the 4th edition being published next month. Ramunas is one of our lead professional services spokespersons on cloud, providing both analytics and strategic advice helping IT services firms identify new opportunities and revenue streams. Today, he will be presenting results from our Managed Private and Professional Services Cloud Benchmark, focusing on cloud professional services. And with that, let me hand this over to Ramunas.
Thank you, Allison. Before I get started, I wanted to quickly cover our cloud program for those that are not familiar with it. TBR this year launched a pretty massive undertaking in terms of really looking in-depth into the cloud market, looking at it from a number of different angles. And as a consequence, we've really developed a number of different offerings in regards to cloud. We have a series of vendor reports which basically focus and look at it through a cloud lens in terms of how various vendors are participating in the cloud market. There are currently over 23 of these reports available right now, and we're adding to it. We're also developed benchmarks for the cloud market. And finally, we've also done a pretty sizable cloud customer research program where we're examining what's happening in the cloud market. Specifically, we're looking, as I mentioned, at 23 different vendors with in-depth reports, but our benchmarks actually include additional vendors. Our public cloud benchmark has over 50 vendors included in it. Our managed private cloud and professional services benchmark has 29 vendors that we compare and contrast. And our cloud components benchmark has 11 vendors that we're currently looking at. In regards to the customer research tracks, we're looking at cloud in terms of really focusing on the private cloud market, the hybrid cloud market, which we believe is up and coming, and we're really trying to get ahead of that, and a continuation of our cloud professional services market, with this being the 4th edition of that kind of study. The program is available to our clients, and certainly if you see or are interested in what we present today or any of these topic areas, certainly feel free to contact your account representative from TBR. So before I get started with the actual presentation here, just so everybody knows where we're coming from. When we look at cloud professional services, we really can consider 3 primary areas: consulting, systems integration, and cloud application development and maintenance and management. 2 weeks ago, I actually covered our cloud managed private cloud services, where we look at hosted workloads, hosted platforms, hosted infrastructure, and hosted business processes. We're not going to be focusing a lot of time on this, but it is included in this presentation because it's an interesting lead-in and contrast to what's happening on the professional services side. So let's get to the information. What we're going to talk about today is what's happening in the cloud professional services market, which of the segments within the cloud professional services market are really generating the most revenues right now, and what are vendors doing to meet demand and really engage and prosper from the shift by many customers into a cloud delivery model for their IT infrastructure, and what kind of services they're providing to support that endeavor. We know that the cloud computing market is very complex, and it definitely requires assistance from IT services vendors. Why we titled this, is what's happening to the cloud markets, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Well, the 2 steps forward we really believe are that managed private cloud and professional services are moving forward hand in hand, step in step. One following the other, in some cases one leading the other. We anticipate that the market for 2013 is going to be an $18 billion market, and it's really going to double to over $30 billion by 2018. So the growth is there, and it's going to continue to expand. As part of the work we've done for the study, we actually have marked and estimated out the total market for cloud professional services and management services. This chart here shows the 2 components and the respective expected growth for each of them. We anticipate that, our estimates are really based on the 29 companies that are actually within the cloud professional services benchmark. We've been able to estimate this out because historically, for all our most benchmarks, we typically account for about 50% of the revenues that are out there in the marketplace. So this is what's really driving underneath our estimates here for the total markets today. We believe the total market for both managed private and professional services cloud revenue is going to grow at a 17% compound annual growth rate. As you can see from the charts, the managed private cloud portion of it is actually growing and is expected to continue to grow at about 18% compound annual rate, and leading to a 16% compound annual rate growth rate for professional services. When we look at the actual players within the benchmark, again, very favorable growth rates, and we're certainly averaging right now on a year-over-year basis for 1Q13 of almost 30% growth. And we're seeing that the managed services revenues are tracking very closely with professional services. The complexity and sheer number of managed service offerings that are being put out there in the marketplace is necessitating that various IT professional services vendors provide the advisory service, the consulting service, the integration service, and even the applications development services to help customers move into a cloud computing environment. There's so much out there in the marketplace that understanding that and developing those resources in-house to understand how every piece fits together is very complex. And as a consequence, the beneficiaries are the professional services firms that are providing consulting and systems integration advice and help. When we look at what's happened over time, and this chart depicts really managed private cloud revenue share versus a professional services revenue share of the total cloud computing market. We see that professional services back in 2011 really accounted for about 25% of the market. But we're seeing that managed services now is actually taking over and is accounting for a bigger percent of the total cloud market. And this really is a consequence of one, the consulting-led approach, especially from our study work back in 2010, indicated that consulting and advisory services were the real preemptive demand drivers for professional services firms. Companies want to understand what cloud could do. Having gained that knowledge of what cloud can do, now they're trying to figure out how to bring it in-house. And they're coming to recognize that the complexity of the system and the fact that your IT services can run anywhere means that you can actually outsource those and really put them in a managed and hosted environment much more easily. And as a consequence, managed hosted services are growing quite well. But there still requires that guidance, assistance, design, build, help, put it in place for us. And then actually, after that, run it for us. That is continuing to support the professional services side of the equation. When we look actually at the players in the marketplace, and this is a chart that really only focuses on our cloud professional services revenue growth, it identifies the 29 companies in the picture here that we look at in our benchmark. There certainly are growth leaders, growth laggards to a certain extent. What's interesting to note is that, across the board, cloud-related professional services is growing and is positive and is averaging about 30% for this whole group. And that's on a year-to-year basis for 1Q 2013. It is outpacing total IT services revenue growth pretty dramatically for a number of different companies. It's basically the shining star in their portfolios, the area where they're seeing a lot of traction. And there's a lot of room for continued growth because many of these firms still cloud only constitutes a small percentage of the total business at the present time. So if you look at actually the vendors here, there are also some newcomers to the marketplace, SAP and TCS. And also you note that we've got some other firms that have, over the last several quarters, had some challenges and struggles. But are beginning to rebound and are seeing the benefits of being actively engaged in the cloud marketplace with cloud professional services. The ones that I'm specifically pointing to here are Atos and Capgemini. Both are seeing traction in the professional services space from that perspective. So, what's the largest segment of cloud? Where are we seeing the most demand? Where is all the revenue coming from? This next chart depicts the three professional services areas that we look at in the benchmark, as well as the managed service component. Managed service dominates. It is the fastest growing right now. But then the second fastest is actually applications development, which is interesting. Certainly, it is outpacing both consulting and systems integration. We believe that this is happening as a consequence that people are recognizing that workloads have to move into the cloud. There needs to be a lot of recoding done to get things moved into the cloud. Yet the revenue streams from applications development are not nearly at the present time as large as the consulting and systems integration, simply from the nature and the scale of the projects themselves and the engagements themselves. On the same token, we believe that while managed services continue to grow so fast, it continues to drive the professional services growth trend. When we look at our just recently completed customer work that hasn't yet been published, but just a little bit of a highlight from that work, we noted that many firms, and especially the firms that are looking at cloud computing, especially in the private area, almost 70% of the firms are looking at engaging cloud professional services firms to embrace hosted private cloud environments. Only 30% are actually building private clouds of their own doing. So the demand for managed hosted services definitely is going to continue to grow. But because there's such a proliferation of various services available out there from a cloud computing standpoint, the need for advisory help and consulting is going to continue to expand in line with the demand for managed services. Well, if you look at the actual pieces of the puzzle, specifically in this slide we identify from our benchmark the growth leaders and how they are performing relative to the total cloud revenue growth. Cloud consulting, the leaders right now are really kind of all smaller size firms, smaller size in terms of their cloud consulting, revenues, but growing very fast. The laggards also are not necessarily the largest firms in the bunch, but they're challenged. They're challenged because they necessarily do not have the cloud consulting capabilities, the systems integration capabilities. They need to develop those and expand those, and that's where they're really, putting their resources in to try to play the catch-up game. On the leader side, we know that there's the newcomers to the market are investing in their cloud portfolios. SAP certainly is doing so. It's increasing their cloud consulting staff and offerings to ensure that cloud is successfully developed and they can generate cloud customer proof points to continue their success in the marketplace. TCS is investing in onshore headcount in the U.S. and Europe, and this enabled them to generate consulting demand from clients because they've developed, really are focusing onshore, face-to-face interactions, and that results in a consultative nature of the engagement, and therefore professional services revenues are coming their way. And then we have several of the other vendors that are moving in the market by really acquiring smaller firms that can help them or partnering through alliances with firms. Atos, in cases, is aligned with Matrix Software in March to resell their Matrix change engine. Here, it's really an opportunity for them to make inroads in the telecom space and really, provide cloud deployed services and or provide the consulting and implementation help with those cloud services. The middle ground is kind of interesting here on this cloud consulting. As we see, there are the big vendors, the ones that have historically had a lot of cloud consulting revenue because they were early to the game. And then they've had past experience with their customers that continues to enable them to, drive their cloud revenues. Because of the fact that they already have a sizable component in cloud consulting, on a dollar basis, they actually lead in terms of what they're gaining on a quarter-to-quarter basis. But in terms of overall growth, the newcomers are really overshadowing them. The real key reason for the success for the major players, and as you can see, there's a couple of them here in the chart that are historically also infrastructure providers, is that candidates that are interested in cloud have turned to them to examine if cloud is appropriate for their existing infrastructure, and whether or not they should move into a cloud environment. And in many cases, that is the route they should and need to go to minimize costs from an IT infrastructure standpoint. And these vendors, the big players, are able to guide them through that journey because they understand the existing infrastructure that a company has. When we look to the next slide here, we actually examine the systems integration revenue streams and who is leading in systems integration. Again, all the names are the same. Their positions shift a little bit slightly. One of the things to note is that systems integration, of the three components of the professional services side of this equation that we look at, systems integration is going the slowest. But slow is kind of relative when you're growing at a 28% year-over-year growth rate. Many of these, and the average here actually is 27%. Now, the ones that are kind of outpacing the remainder of the group are really having a lot of success because they're focused on the private cloud market, and specifically, helping firms move into private clouds. Now, overall, systems integration embodies that you're going to be changing something and you're actually helping a client change and move. It's an area where many of the engagements right now continue to be still on the smaller level. As a consequence of that, many firms are looking at moving only portions of their business into a cloud environment, be it private or public or even a hybrid potentially. And it's test cases. The fact that you've got some newcomers, they're also trying to establish themselves in the marketplace, and they're working the market the same way. Small engagements, let's take a small piece, move it for you, convince you that this works, which will eventually evolve into let's move far more portions of your workload or your environment or your whole infrastructure into the cloud. So some of the winners here, certainly one that we know from a systems integration, SAP, with their acquisition of Ariba, has really focused on scaling up their abilities to help clients and integrate Ariba into existing SAP environments. So they're generating any systems integration work from that standpoint. We know that VMware, for instance, is certainly moving forwards also with infrastructure investments to support the vCloud hybrid service. And accompanying that, you've got a lot of systems integration as well as consulting going along. And you have to build out those skill sets to make sure that you're successful in the marketplace with your customers. So the last group we actually look at is application development and maintenance. Not surprising in this space, some of the leaders from the other couple of pages actually shift down a little bit and are not necessarily considered the growth leaders. We really see a predominance of the Indian-based vendors here. They have historically been very strong in the applications development area, and they recognize that they have to shift to focus on cloud enablement, cloud applications development. Within the, one of the big vendors that does appear on this list, HP, has had some success in the marketplace with applications development as a consequence of their actual systems integration work. They're cross-selling applications development to assist legacy migration to the cloud. Excuse me. On the other hand, for instance, Infosys, one of the big players that actually is growing pretty reasonably in the applications development area, is successfully expanding their consulting capabilities and therefore convincing clients through consulting that yes, they also need to look at their applications and their workloads and convert them into cloud-enabled versions. So they're having success from that standpoint as well. So having covered kind of the pieces of the puzzle, we really want to understand, so what's the one step back? What's happening in the marketplace, why we believe that they're all taking kind of a little step back? We know from the very beginning that everybody's trying to figure out how to monetize and make cloud work for them. How do you, make money in the cloud market? Many of the professional services firms recognize very quickly that, advisory services is key, because people just didn't understand cloud. So they shifted portfolios to address that issue and move in that direction. At the same token, they all realize that, cloud is a new endeavor, and there is a huge shortage of cloud-enabled people that can actually help and provide in terms of delivering the professional services entities that you need. This chart here actually looks at headcount growth and what's happening with headcount growth relative for some of the major cloud players. It was spectacular in terms of headcount growth, in terms of looking at what is happening with averaging about 40% headcount growth in cloud across the board over the last 5 quarters. It very much tracked to a certain extent what was happening from a revenue perspective. But what we've seen is that the gap is narrowing, but it's still quite it's positive. Firms recognize, and this is where some of them have to take a step back, that they just can't sell cloud without having the skill sets in-house to provide the consulting, the systems integration, the applications development work. As a consequence, the various professional systems vendors are really trying to augment their staffs so that they can assist in providing basically the staff support necessary for their clients. Generating these and creating these experts is a major undertaking. It requires that your overall cloud staff is going to expand. And they're not doing necessarily just from pure hiring. What we're also seeing is that many of the vendors are engaging in very aggressive education programs within their organizations, training their consultants in cloud, training their delivery staffs in cloud, and in also taking it one step further and recognizing that they have to train their sales staffs in cloud as well. For many of the firms in the study, the sales staffs not only are selling the cloud professional services, but they're also engaging in selling cloud services. And that whole engagement model really is different, in terms of how you're compensated and how you sell, the services. So the re-education really is essential and necessary, and it goes hand in hand with what's happening in the marketplace, that, you have to staff up, and the various professional services are really addressing the demand for cloud by trying to build their internal staffs, because customers just can't afford to do so. To learn everything about anything, everything about, managed hosted cloud or various SaaS applications, and whether or not one's more appropriate than another, takes many hours, days, years in some cases. But you can call on a professional services firm that works with it on a daily basis, and they can help very quickly, but they need to have the staff to be able to do so, and that's why the continued headcount growth is essential for them. The other half of the equation, and since there is a shortage of cloud-capable personnel, is that the various cloud vendors are really working and building out their model by building out their cloud portfolios through alliances and partnerships. The proliferation of these continues. This is actually a slimmed-down version. Some of the vendors actually have alliances and partnerships that range in the 100-plus range. So there certainly is the approach they're doing, and this is basically leveraging a number of ISVs in most cases, and their expertise and their knowledge to help build cloud solutions. And as part of the process, they really also are, to a certain extent, especially with smaller ISVs, looking at these partners as potential takeover candidates. So the building of these cloud solutions in conjunction with the alliance partners is really how the various vendors are addressing the marketplace. They're ingraining IP into their solutions. They're patenting it so that it becomes almost an exclusive solution, which makes it very difficult for a competing vendor then to get in if they are successful in their first pass with the customer. The acquisition route, however, is really an interesting one, because all the IT services vendors are acquiring firms, and they're acquiring, in many cases, software firms. Some of those software firms do have also professional services staffs of their own, which then basically expands their capabilities from that standpoint and addresses the headcount issue. But also it's really trying to create niche markets and really grabbing off and trying to identify, what is the best solution for a given client. From an acquisition standpoint, over the last month, there's been a myriad of acquisitions. We all heard that IBM acquired SoftLayer, and that was a pretty significant acquisition. But over the last month, VMware bought Desktone, CSC acquired Service Mesh, Oracle acquired Big Machines, and just within the last couple of days, OpenText bought GXX. And both of these are actually software firms, but they are building in size and scale to address the cloud market, and it's quite possible that they themselves may actually at some point be partaking in the cloud professional services side of the equation. But acquisitions actually enable the large firms that keep acquiring smaller firms to expand their professional services portfolio. They add the acquisition and the knowledge around the acquisition to their portfolio. They can consult on that, help build, ingrain, and embed that into their cloud solution. So it's a synergistic effect, in terms of helping various customers solve their cloud business questions and challenges with cloud-related infrastructure, and using the acquisitions as a mechanism to do so more successfully. So with that, we've covered really, what's happening in the marketplace. We definitely see managed services and professional services growing at a pretty substantial rate within the cloud market. Professional services and systems integration actually are growing hand in hand. They're both still not nearly as large as managed services, and we would expect that that be the case. That's nothing really new, but they are definitely growing, and we expect it to continue to grow at an 18% rate. And then finally, we are going to continue to see the vendors reacting with new offerings, new acquisitions, new IP developed solutions to help clients, partake in the cloud marketplace, and they themselves grow and prosper from that perspective. So with that, I'll take the first question.
Great, and thanks to those of you who sent through questions already. Those of you who have questions outstanding, please send them through now. Romanus, the first question we have is, what do you believe is the key trend that will depict the cloud professional services market over the upcoming years?
Key single trend, or there's a couple of trends, but I think overall, and this may be a little bit hard to understand, I think the key trend we're going to see is that there's going to continue to be proliferation, but there's also going to continue to be consolidation. And those may sound like they're in contradiction with each other, but actually they're not. The proliferation is in terms of really what the various IT professional services vendors are offering to their constituents. They're expanding their solutions, they're expanding how they're addressing the marketplace, and many of them have their own cloud services, and they're expanding the breadth and depth of those portfolios. And along with it comes consulting and professional services. So therefore, they are proliferating what's out there in the market, and that in itself makes the market much more complex and requires then assistance from a professional services vendor. On the other hand, the consolidation is because of acquisitions, and I kind of mentioned it at the tail end here. They're occurring on a weekly, in some cases daily basis. Smaller firms, especially many of the smaller software firms, are being swallowed up by larger professional services firms. They're being swallowed up because they bring basically a product with them that can be sold in the cloud as a cloud service, and therefore it kind of justifies you being also in the cloud market providing professional services along with that product. And it basically tries to create differentiation and niche plays in the cloud market. So while the number of offerings proliferate, the number of players probably will continue to consolidate, and I think that's the key trend that's occurring in the marketplace.
Okay. The next question we have, what do you think the next shift is in cloud professional services revenues? First it was consulting-led, then managed services-led. What's next?
That's an interesting question. We definitely see, and actually some of the research work just completed, certainly suggests that the hosting and focusing on hosted private clouds is where the market is right now. We know for a fact that the public cloud offerings are less expensive than private. They cost less. So there's certainly going to be a continued demand in that area, which is going to propagate and drive people to looking at hybrid environments, where some of the workloads are in the public space, others are in the private space. This is going to necessitate a much more complex managed service, where you manage not just a given set of infrastructure that's behind a firewall or hosted for the customer, but it integrates numbers of different services, possibly from numbers of different locations. They all have to be managed. And then we're seeing that there are a number of firms that are now taking it one step further and basically starting to provide orchestration services. Certainly cataloging all the cloud services that are available out there and identifying which ones will work for a given client will be probably the wave of the future. And again, it's a professional services play. You manage it, you figure it out, you continue to work with your clients to see what will work and what will not work in their environment, and what the challenges they face and where they need improvement. And that's going to, I think, drive the marketplace forward, and it's going to be the next wave. Ultimately, it may all end with it all circling back, and somebody's going to have to take on and manage the whole infrastructure after it becomes so complex that it really could push back to the traditional systems integrators, the large companies with a large scale that can handle multiple different cloud offerings out there in the marketplace and understand how they all work to gain traction again.
Okay, the next question we have, will the large professional services firms be able to return to growth leadership position in the cloud professional services market?
The quick answer is yes, and actually it dovetails to the last question in terms of I foresee that we're going to actually have almost a re-swinging of a pendulum back to the large professional services firms. The ones that have the scale, the manpower to manage very complex hybrid cloud environments of the future are probably going to be the winners here. That means that you not only need to be able to manage in a given region, but really on a global basis, because many of the largest firms are global scale. You want to simplify the infrastructure and have similar type workings across the globe. And the large systems integrators, the traditionally large systems integrators, are probably going to have a very significant services play from that perspective, because they're going to be the only ones that will have the scale to be able to manage those kind of environments for the future.
Okay. We have another question. Do you see a market here for local or regional cloud professional services providers, especially in Europe or APAC?
Yes, and actually we know that some of the vendors are actually approaching the marketplace from the perspective of we can engineer a managed hosted private cloud service, but it may, because of regional issues or differences or regulations, be actually a requirement that the hosted nature of that whole establishment may have to be within the given country. We know that some of the vendors are working very closely, and again, this is part of the Alliance and channel programs, to identify who can provide those kind of services within a given region. The larger systems integrators can actually come up with a solution and then simply pass it down into the region and let it be operated by a channel partner from that perspective. So there definitely is a need for cloud, professional services providers that are regionally located, that actually provide the cloud services. The managers of those services certainly can be of much larger and or global scale.
Okay. It doesn't look like we have any other questions in queue, so maybe I'll talk slow for a second in case anybody has any last-minute questions. Maurice, you want to talk to this slide real quick?
Well, I just wanted to, we have several additional webinars coming up in regards to our cloud program track, and we will be providing these webinars all throughout next year as well, in terms of as we produce these reports on semi-annual basis. The next one, we haven't yet determined exactly, but we'll be putting out a cloud components benchmark, and also a public cloud benchmark is coming in 2014 in January. The more current one coming in within the next week is our private cloud customer research study, where we're examining what's actually happening in the managed private cloud marketplace, what workloads are moving, what customers are buying from that perspective, where there's the most interest, and how the various vendors are performing and delivering those workloads. We'll be following that up with a cloud professional services customers study that is going to be in December. And then the hybrid cloud is targeted, the customer research work is targeted for January. And again, all these will really recycle again in 6 months from the delivery dates, because we want this as an ongoing program, and we're really trying to focus to make it much more current. So that's why especially our customer research work is being executed on a semi-annual basis, so there's an update every 6 months.
So with that, I think it's time to draw the presentation to a close. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, Ramunis, for the presentation. As I mentioned, I was going to share all the social media links with you. So this presentation, the recording of the presentation will be put up on YouTube by tomorrow, and as I mentioned, we'll be sending out all of the slides to everyone who registered for today's webcast by tomorrow as well. We also encourage you to follow Ramunis and TBR on Twitter at the handles listed here to join in the conversation about what's happening in our research and what's happening in the market. Before you sign off, there's a short survey that I'm asking you to fill out. 3 quick questions. Did you find today's presentation valuable? How good was the presenter? And if there's any open-ended comments that you'd like to give us on either the topics or areas of research or any feedback. This feedback is being used to improve our presentations quarter to quarter, so anything you do share with us will be taken into great consideration. We've enjoyed the interaction today. I'm going to leave the chat function open for another couple of minutes in case anyone has any last-minute questions or comments that you'd like to put through. Otherwise, as Maruna said, we will be doing a similar webinar in 6 months' time, and we look forward to talking with you about the cloud market as it evolves. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.